Tenera koto katoa, naumai haremai ki te whanganuiatara. Thanks to Hāpi Research for getting us all together and letting me talk about hop flavor and aroma. I wanted to talk about a couple things today. First, how we work to achieve that goal of maximizing our unique microclimate and land. And this inevitably leads into a discussion of hop terpenes and esters and thiols. And hopefully through this process, I can kind of tie that chemistry into a picture of how we think about maximizing appealing flavor and aroma in our hops. And I also wanted to talk a bit about our breeding program and how we're thinking about breeding hops and selecting hops, and just sort of give you a bit of insight into those efforts. And before I dive in, just first a little bit of a disclaimer. So I'm going to be talking about and showing parts of rapidly growing data sets, evolving methods. There's significant degrees of uncertainty with some of this. As much as possible, I'm going to try to be clear about that degree of confidence that we have. But these are evolving things. We want to try to provide you with insights into how we're thinking about what we see, but they are evolving things. Please don't take what I say as the gospel. Ask probing questions, push back on our assumptions. So with that warning, I'll dive in. First, a bit about our breeding efforts. Our program really started 4 years ago, and with any plant breeding, it takes a little while to get going. So we're now finally getting to the stage where we're in steady production and release mode. And what that means is that we've got advanced selections actually coming out of the pipeline now. We've got exciting things that we can show people to rub, things that are being scaled up. We're working very hard to, as much as possible, because we're quite early in our breeding journey, jump exciting things from early stage, single plant, to thousands of plants as quickly as we can. This isn't easy, so please bear with us. We have various growing cock-ups where we tell you all the heaps, and then there's like a tiny amount. Just getting nursery plants through that process, getting brewable material out really fast is a big challenge. There's just sort of real world working with what's happening season to season. Difficulties. We've had some wins, we've had some losses. We will keep working on getting better at it, but we generally have the overarching philosophy that we want to try to get things out and get them validated by brewers in the real world as fast as possible. So that's sort of an overarching drive of what we do. So kind of diving briefly into how do we achieve that speed of selection and speed of release at this point. I think it's really down to one key pace of process, which is that sensory is driving our breeding program. Most of the compounds that we're after, as Scott and Laura did a fantastic job of illustrating, are parts per trillion, parts per billion things. They have just very, very low olfactory perception thresholds, so people are great at spotting these aromas. We're very, very attuned to these tropical flavors, and we're fantastic at finding them. But the flip side of that is it's very expensive and very challenging to actually measure these things in the lab, and so sensory really is it's our only cost-effective solution. And we've built most of our screening efforts around utilizing sensory to find things as fast as possible with the least cost and push them through the pipeline quickly if they continue to be perceived as exciting. So our sensory panel is rubbing every single viable seedling pretty much every year. Where we can, we're performing dry hop trials with most of these potential new selections at a very early stage. Once seedlings enter our kind of further evaluation group, things that might be perceived as exciting or that we think initially are exciting, we're attempting where we can to fast track those things, to hold them for multi-plant trials or to even go larger. Or in some cases, they get reevaluated and they get discarded because we've got to be a bit brutal. And if the sensory is not ending up as this is really exciting, then sorry, we can't keep holding on to it. Our sensory panel that we're using to evaluate these things is made up of brewers, primarily from Garage Project, experienced hop evaluators, and our breeder, Joe. I have to give a huge acknowledgement to Joe Stevens. He's our primary day-to-day breeder. He's on the farm every day at harvest. He's out there, he's finding things. He's been just absolutely instrumental in both developing clever technique, clever process, and really helping us to be efficient and quick. And I think, hats off to Joe for being just super clever on some of these things. Our sensory process is really focused on finding incredibly exciting new seedlings. We're pretty easily able to churn out large numbers of like good seedlings, but our view is that good just doesn't cut it. That that's not going to be effective, and that's not going to be something that we think is worth putting our time and effort into. So it's very, very focused on standouts. If something smells incredible, it's going to get fast-tracked. If it doesn't smell incredible, it's going to get discarded. And we think that is the most efficient and effective process that we have available to us. We do, after the fact, do bits of chemistry, but I think as Laura and Scott both alluded to, that chemistry is often rather expensive. So at thousands of samples scale, it's just not feasible. So that's kind of a bit of insight into the process of finding things. Roughly speaking, we're just ruthlessly sort of focused on exciting, and everything else goes by the wayside. So how are we generating all these seedlings that have potential to be exciting? Where is that coming from? We're using all the tools in our toolbox, everything that we have available to us, to try to drive diversity of outcomes in terms of seedlings. So we're trying to get as broad a population as possible, with the assumption that in that broad diversity, there'll be exciting things somewhere in that spectrum. We think that unique, appealing, and intense character is possible across a pretty broad array of sort of characters. So we're not overly focused on tropical or citrus. It's really about finding intensity that is highly appealing, and that's the game for us. We use a lot of controlled pollination to try to drive diversity while having a little bit of control of our genetic inputs. We use quite a bit of elite parental lines, both New Zealand and North American varietals. A few novel mutational and fertilization techniques to try to just increase the diversity of our germplasm, and making sure that we're increasing the diversity of both our female and our male germplasm. The male germplasm is always a little trickier because you can't rub those and smell them. So it's a little bit of a more challenging place to chase diversity, but we are doing what we can to make sure we get diversity on both sides of the house there. And then a few other creative solutions. I wish I could delve a little deeper into some of these, but there's some new proprietary techniques that we're employing, and we have to have a little bit of respect for the IP of our breeders and our genetic partners. So I think that the best way to say is there's interesting paces of work being done to drive up that genetic diversity and to drive that diversity of outcomes in the seedlings. And then we are screening as rapidly as we can that broad set of seedlings for exciting and intense. And I think that's sort of the nutshell of what we're after with that. So dive kind of into the other piece that I wanted to talk about, which is how do we pursue unique and appealing character in our hops? And I think it bears a discussion of where this is coming from and how we think about this. So as I go on, I'll use the term terroir to describe mostly that microclimate and land that's creating those expressed phenotypes in our hops. And I'll use the term terroir expression to try to capture the broader. So all of those environmental impacts, the cultural practices, operating processes, the people, all those things that massively affect the unique flavors and aromas of our hops. I probably consider, when I say terroir expression, I probably have a broader view of what that is than perhaps the normal usage. And I think it's really critical to highlight the huge influence that our people and our processes have on the flavors and aromas that we're generating. It's very much driven by the people and the actions, and our land and our climate certainly have an impact, but there's also a very, very large impact of who's doing it and what we're doing. So when we think about that terroir expression, the flavor and aroma matrix of our hops, that is what you're getting in finished beer. We really are focused on 3 categories: polyfunctional thiols, aromatic esters, and terpene alcohols. And those compounds are a relatively small percentage of the hop oil, but they're a huge component of the flavor impact, and they're a huge driver of cold side flavor and of our sort of experience and our perception of that final hoppy character. Those compounds really, it's their presence that's affecting character. It's the interactions between them, that matrix effect. So, the perception of our hops isn't just about thiols or aromatic esters. It's that combination that is acting synergistically a lot of the time to boost perception, or occasionally, there's interactions that are damping or are masking components of that. So it's both sides of it. Those components that we're focusing on are generally, they're less than 10% of hops. So this is a little bit of a repeat of, I think, what Scott and Laura showed. But it's the less than 1% items that are really, really impactful. And it means that we've got to be quite thoughtful about what we're doing. The big, easy things to measure are not as impactful in terms of cold side character. I think there have been some really interesting studies in the wine world over the last sort of 10, 15 years, especially those of Banquets and Nicolau, looking at the matrix effect on perception and these classes of compounds. And a lot of these studies, the way that they're looking at that matrix effect is they're taking a Sauv Blanc wine and they're removing one compound from it and saying, okay, how has this affected perception of it? And some of the biggest impacts have been from removal of terpene alcohols, so things like linalool and geraniol. With them removed, these compounds, which should be just adding a little bit of floral and citrusy, they are massively decreasing perception of some of the fruity tropical characters, and just also the overall hedonic liking of the wine suddenly is significantly decreased when those things are removed. And I think more recently there's been some interesting studies looking at some of the estery compounds like 2-methyl isobutyrate, and finding very much the same thing. When these compounds aren't present, our perception of these thiols, even though they're at the same concentrations, is significantly reduced. So clearly that overall matrix effect is quite important in terms of how we perceive what we're getting in finished beer. So I'd like to highlight free thiols. This is a little bit of a repeat of probably the list you've seen before, but I think one of the things that I really like to point out in this is that there's an array of compounds that are definitely in our hops. They're definitely present at well above their olfactory perception threshold, but we don't have good testing available. So things like 3S4-MPa, 3SO, we know they're there. We know they're there in pretty large quantities, but we don't have a good answer today. There's literally no labs in the world that can provide us a really accurate concentration at any kind of reasonable commercial price. And these are just the compounds that we know of, and there's almost certainly a further array of compounds that are also above their olfactory threshold perception threshold, and also are impacting flavor and aroma that we're not even aware of that, and we're definitely not measuring them. So I think that's a sort of critical one to keep in mind. I'll talk a bit about in hops how these are coming about. Laura nicely did a good job of covering the biochemical pathway in the plant, so I'll sort of gloss over that slightly. But within hops, these compounds, these free thiols, they're forming, they're accumulating largely in response to cell damage and wounding, pathogen attack, and the annual senescence cycle activating. So that senescence cycle is that annual dieback cycle of the hops. It's been shown in numerous crop types, very, very carefully studied in grapes, that these volatile thiols, they're accumulating and their precursors are accumulating in response to wounding and disease. They're compounds that are often highly cytotoxic, and the way that cells typically detoxify them is through adding a glutathione. And so that's where, with hops, you're getting thiol precursors that are being delivered, and free thiols are simply those thiols that are there and present that haven't been sort of detoxified. So there's definite limitations to ultimately biologically how much of these free thiols can be present, because they are somewhat cytotoxic. So they occur also as a result of just that normal photosynthetic metabolism shutting down as well, but that's again tied back to that senescence cycle, where the plant enters that annual dieback and you start to get catabolic pathways being activated, the plant breaking things down and sending sugars back down to the rhizome. I think a great example of this in action has been pretty carefully studied in the wine world, where mechanically harvested grapes produce much, much larger amounts of precursor than hand-harvested grapes. And it's been shown it's largely a response to that cell damage that's occurring through mechanical harvesting. You know, those grapes and the grapevines are getting hit pretty hard by that mechanical harvester, and in response, they're activating these pathways, and you're getting, in the case of grapes, you're getting large amounts of precursor forming in the berries. Presumably in hops and other plants, that same general pathway is what's generating free thiols. So why does that plant metabolism, cell biology matter? Our cultural practices, the things we're doing in the field, the treatments that we're using, the fertilizer, how we do those things up to harvest, they can all impact flavor and aroma compounds, and they can all either help or do nothing or harm. And I think this is a huge area of exploration that hasn't particularly been delved into, but I think will be a big place of further exploration and growth in this space, is how do these things that we do, how are our normal farming practices impacting final concentrations, and what can we do to actually improve them? Can we induce stress that's non-destructive? Can we find other ways of activating these stress response pathways? Can we kind of take advantage of that annual senescence cycle? These are all the topics that we are thinking about, but we don't yet have a brilliant answer to. So I think I pressed something wrong. So how do we think about, with our own farm, maximizing harvest and maximizing those compounds? I think one of the biggest contributors there is harvest and harvest process. And for us, thinking about harvest timing and driving that, we are really focused on that piece of the puzzle. Traditionally, harvest timing was driven by growers' intuition, sort of witchcrafty type stuff. Things like field dry matter of the cones, total oil, alpha acids. I think more recently we've seen the rise of processor and seller-driven pre-prescribed picking windows. For us, we don't rely on alpha or dry matter to drive precise harvest timing. We've found that these things aren't accurate predictors of the flavor and aroma profile that we're seeking to achieve. They're much more general indicators. They can tell you, are you roughly sort of in the zone of where you should be, but they're not accurate enough to drive outcomes, we think. They aren't, if you want to sort of delve deeply into it, they aren't highly correlated with hedonic liking in finished beer. They're just very general. And then added on top of that, you've got pretty significant year-to-year just seasonal variation that significantly affects these things. So there's a lot of pieces of noise there and not a ton of signal. I don't think the other answers like preordained picking windows, I don't think that's any more effective. And I think especially in light of the climactic variability that we see now, our expectation going forward is that these sort of historical averages for varietals are pretty much just that. They're historical. It's hard to believe that we're not going forward going to see a hell of a lot more variability there. That's another piece that I think is just sort of, it's questionable whether that's a reliable go-forward indicator. And then again, I haven't seen anything published that there's evidence that these picking windows, differentiate between maximum hedonic liking and, an average result. I think quite likely they reduce extremes, but I think they're probably not things that would drive optimal process. So our general goal is to pick as many blocks at the perfect time as possible, and to do so while generating a spread of lots that encompasses all of the perfect profiles that brewers ask us for. So with some varietals, that might be 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 profiles for that varietal that a brewer is after. And that's obviously easier said than done. In some cases, with some of the varietals, that maximum hedonic liking by a brewer is at a point or a timing that's really close to something high risk for us as a grower, either really close to massive yield loss or really close to generation of undesirable flavors and aromas. I think that is a key piece of the process, is optimizing the good and then also knowing how to try to avoid the negative. So a little bit on just field sensory and kind of how we go about it. It's really the main driver of our harvest timing. It's just systematic and repeated rubbing impressions with goal aroma profiles and also a bit of shared descriptive language. In many cases, we know what the target aromas are. We know them very well. Pretty much everyone, even pretty inexperienced staff, can figure out, oh, okay, yeah, this is mega tropical. Okay, that's where we want to be. I think in some cases it's a little more challenging. For some varietals, the goal is one specific profile, but I think in general, with a lot of varietals, there's 2 or more targets. Someone might want a version of Motueka that's a little more bright citrusy. Someone else might be after a version of Motueka that's much more tropical. And just knowing what those goals are and then making sure that we achieve an appropriate amount of each of those profiles. As I mentioned before, most of these compounds that we're chasing have very low olfactory perception thresholds. So sensory is just really highly effective in targeting those compounds. It's relatively easy in the field to find those things. And directly measuring them is very difficult. As was alluded to earlier, and I think I've said, there's just a handful of labs that can give us really accurate data. Those labs generally charge us a quite large amount of money for that testing. It's a little bit painful. It's also, timing-wise, quite slow. So getting turnaround is not rapid, and it's just not viable to sort of fall back on that lab testing answer to find the things we want to find. So for us, we're going through harvest. We're producing a daily ranking of harvest priority, where things are, where we think they're gonna hit in terms of their profile. For the more data geeks here, we use a multi-factor least absolute deviation regression model. That LED model is a convenient way to cope with the noise that's present in unstructured natural data. So trying to just compress the influence that extreme outliers would have on our harvest model, rather than a more typical ordinary least squares regression where those outliers are going to have a much more significant impact on that outcome. So as we gather this data, each day we re-rank our list, and that drives what we do going forward through harvest. We've managed to evolve our harvest process from where it was pretty reactionary, I would say, to one that's now pretty reliably nowcasting and very, very solidly forecasting the next sort of 3, 4, 5 days in front of us. Our long-term goal is to hopefully try to get to a place where perhaps we're pretty reliably forecasting 5 to 7 days in front of us. And I think, we think that we're headed in that direction and that we're sort of pretty solidly along the way. But it's definitely a work in progress. What you can see on the chart here behind me is a semantic differential chart. So it's looking at the range of scoring at harvest between various observers. And what I think is really interesting to highlight here is that a lot of these compounds are just very well known. People are very familiar with onion garlic, with tropical aromas, with citrus, with grassy aromas. And actually, untrained people are surprisingly consistent in terms of their sensory evaluation. You can see on the chart, there's actually not as much variability, certainly as we would have thought initially going into this. And a lab grade, highly structured sensory effort is not necessary to get valuable information back out of what's happening. It's really about quantity and repetition. And if you have enough samples and people are roughly pretty decent at this, actually there's really actionable information that comes out of it. You don't need lab grade evaluation to have some pretty valuable stuff that you find. Jump to the next thing. So in terms of how that then does actually correlate to the chemistry, our analysis has found that field sample evaluation of these variables, citrus, tropical, grassy aromas, they are very predictive of final pellet concentrations of Freestyles, especially, here is an example with Nelson Sauvin. People are very good at perceiving these things. we've never had a lot that was tested and that showed really high concentrations of free thiols that we didn't think smelled super tropical. People are just great at finding these aromas. Some of the variables that we're looking at are negatively correlated with thiol concentrations, so probably good to know, like grassy and vegetal intensity is typically negatively correlated with thiol concentrations. And as you'd expect, citrus and tropical are positively correlated. And what you're seeing here on the graph is, on the y-axis, a standardized measure of those sensory components that's been scaled 1 to 10. So it's just an easier way to visualize that sensory model that's sort of underpinning what we're doing. And it's just a scaled combination of all those sensory inputs. And you can see it's surprisingly well correlated with free thiol concentrations. So that kind of, I think, describes that harvest process. In terms of post-harvest, then, what are we doing to not lose all those nice things? I think it's pretty straightforward post-harvest. It's finding every place where we can minimize oxidation. These compounds are reasonably readily oxidized. We just want to minimize that oxidation every step of the way. So kilning, it's just moderate heat kilning, lots of airflow, trying to minimize volatilization and oxidation of these compounds. So trying to either not lose them at the top of the kiln shed, or not lose them through oxidation, and then pelleting quickly. Again, minimize oxidation, minimize mechanical damage. Same thing in the mill. Minimize heat, minimize oxidation, all those bits of the process, just trying to preserve everything that's been generated in the field. Generally speaking, with almost everything that we're after, heat and oxygen are the enemy, and we're just trying to find every place that we can to reduce those things. And in terms of, is the overall process working? We can see from testing that we're generating very, very high amounts of free thiols relative to other growing areas. I think, overall, we're already in a terroir where we can generate relatively high amounts. And I think we're focused on finding all those levers that we can pull to get them as high as possible to maximize that intensity. So a little bit on terroir expression and odor detection thresholds. I think terroir expression has a huge impact on hop character within varietals. And I think sometimes it's helpful to think about this in terms of other crops and kind of remind ourselves of okay, well, look, all Roma tomatoes don't taste the same. It's pretty self-evident. All Sauv Blanc grown all over the world does not taste the same. I think that one's pretty obvious. So clearly within varietals, this terroir expression pace has massive impact. And I think one of the places where it's really interesting to start considering is just with those dry hop additions and thinking about what's going in. So in talking to brewers, I often see this sort of focus on varietals for specific uses. And I think it's an understandable and easy shorthand for the industry. But I do think it's a little bit naive, and it's almost certainly suboptimal way of kind of considering that hop addition process. Clearly thinking about the inputs in terms of the specific lots that you have to use is a better answer, I think. And I think that requires a bit of a deeper understanding of hop terroir and the hop lots that you have that you're using. But I think there's really significant value to better understanding it. Hop forward beer, getting more expressive lots that either avoid excessive green character or have more citrus intensity or whatever the case may be is super valuable. And in terms of how to put this into practice in your brewery, I think it's really about thinking about those dry hop additions especially, but all hop additions in terms of flavor and aroma impact per addition rather than sort of an indiscriminate grams per liter or pounds per barrel target. And I think here you can see a bit of data just looking at specific compounds from specific hop lots. In this case, I've actually used lots from Sam at Other Half. I think Sam's very thoughtful about this subject, so I felt like it was sort of appropriate to throw that one in there. But you can see different hop lots, different varietals contribute wildly different amounts of these compounds, and I think thinking a little more carefully about those additions in terms of the specific lots that you've got rather than varietals can lead to a lot of potential efficiency gain or flavor impact improvement. Finding hops to go into a specific beer that have much higher concentrations of the good stuff means either you can use a little less or you can use the same amount and get significantly more impact. And to make this sort of thing work requires roughly two pieces of knowledge. One, the final concentrations of the compounds that you're after, so those odor detection threshold multiples, and the concentrations of the compounds in the hops that are going in. And I think it sounds a little bit daunting, but exact concentrations aren't necessary for this. Estimates are fine, and generally we're really good. People are great at detecting a lot of these compounds. So, rubbing your lots and figuring out, okay, do I have a lot of mosaic that's just super tropical? Okay, this is probably quite high in 3S4MP. This is probably something that, I can use just a little bit less of to hit that same impact. Or if I'm looking to punch that up, okay, this is probably a lot that's gonna achieve that for me at actually a reasonable hopping rate. So I think another way to sort of think about it or consider it is, to actually do some of those calculations. So I did just a very rough, two different examples here, looking at a couple beers. So the first beer would be a beer that's dry hopped with Nelson Sauvin and Southern Cross at 15 grams per liter. And just looking at what that would mean in terms of concentrations of these compounds and how altering that mix of what's going in would affect what you get out the other end into finished beer. This is obviously pretty sort of rough, but you can see that you can significantly alter the ratio of some of these hop varietals and still get out the other end very, very large multiples of the odor detection threshold. So I think being thoughtful about what's coming in then allows you to have a few more levers to pull in terms of what's going out to achieve really exciting outcomes, either at slightly better efficiency with a few less hops in there, or by altering slightly what you're doing to get sort of a more interesting thing out the other end. So I had to throw this in. Is there a shortcut? Because this is, I think, the most common question I get asked. Is there a shortcut there? So I think, one is the exact multiples aren't that important. I think it's really about understanding the trade-offs and the benefits that each lot that you have available to use is bringing, and whether that actual perceived flavor is going to be highly impacted or minimally impacted by changes. Knowing a bit about those odor detection thresholds and what's probably in your hops is going to be really helpful. Clearly, there's some sort of additional considerations here of like, well, how much does that flavor matrix effect boost perception of a few of these things, or the reverse? How much of off aromas are masking perception or raising that odor detection threshold? So a little bit of complexity, but I also think just a bit of sort of messing around generally gets you to answers on that pretty quickly, because again, people are just really good at detecting these aromas. I think more broadly, I just want to highlight that character and chemistry can vary quite significantly within varietals. So, like if I had a spider graph of every lot of Cascade grown last season all over the world, it would be bonkers. It would show just like a completely absurd level of variability. So, I think that with that context, I think it's quite valuable to think about the lots that you have and what that individual lot brings, a bit more than perhaps like what that varietal brings. And I think, it's a key piece of finding the exact flavor and aroma or finding uniqueness in terms of that brewing process. I think one of the other interesting things that's been published over the last few years, just generally in this space, was some data from Laurent Dagan and Christine Schroneberger. And they were looking at 2019 US grown varietals. I think it was Citra, Mosaic, Cascade, Simcoe, and Sabro maybe. But they actually did a very careful evaluation of location and process and the effects there on free thiol concentrations in T90s. And they found that terroir had, the land location where the hops were grown, had a pretty minimal to moderate effect on free thiol concentrations, and that harvest process and timing had a much, much larger effect on these things. So with us, with our own hops, we've come to the same conclusion that Laurent reached, which is that there's a lot more impact from process than there is from just purely what piece of dirt those hops came out of. And because of that, I think it's a really interesting place to explore as a brewer what lots are going to be effective for you in what usage cases. Broadly speaking, when you're trying to make something super expressive, we would say, okay, well, look, something that's really high in free thiols and something that's really high in terpene alcohols and esters is going to be a fantastic combination. It's pretty well shown that there is a synergistic effect of all those compounds and that they probably are going to boost perception. So out the other end, you're probably going to get a more exciting result there. And then for three hop combinations, sort of a riff on the same thing, but having plenty of those two sort of key driver inputs, free thiols, terpene alcohols, and esters, and then also adding something that's going to be complementary is a pretty sort of sweet spot to be in. So I think Pete's trying to get me off the stage. I could go all day.
I've been in.
Did I go over it?
A little. I've been hanging out with Dave, annoying him during harvest for the last 2 weeks, and I can absolutely attest to the fact he has a passion for this topic that could fill at least 2 or 3 of the sessions today. So yeah, put your hands together again for Dave Dunbar. That was awesome.